Thank you very much, Kathy, for that word of welcome. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with all of you today in large numbers. My goodness, this is very flattering. The topic is one, of course, that is dear to us all. It is the question, how we say goodbye. This topic has its origin, actually, in a homily that I preached back in 2003. It was the Feast of All Souls, November 2nd, and it coincidentally happened to fall on a Sunday. And so it was the Sunday Mass, was the Feast of All Souls. And so I thought it would be apropos to preach on what are our Catholic funeral traditions, the traditions surrounding the passing of someone. And in addition to the homily, I also prepared a small pamphlet, the latest edition of which was given out to those who came in, so you should have a sheet of that. I had no idea how popular that pamphlet would become. I remember giving it out at the parish and one elderly lady saying, "I want 3 of them." I said, "What do you need 3 of them for?" She said, "I want to give them to my kids so they know what to do when I die." I hadn't clued into that being an interest, so I'm not sure why you're here. Hopefully that's not your particular concern, but nevertheless, there is obviously a need for education, there is a need for communication around this, and the pamphlet has served its purpose over the years. And as I say, there is a latest edition, which was prepared for this conference, which has been given out to you, and which will be posted to my website, bishopdowd.net, afterwards, so that you can get a copy. And it's been printed on white paper, so that it's easy for you to photocopy if you so feel the need. And as I say, it has proven to be useful over the years. So that is the remote origin of this. Now, some time ago, Kathy had asked me for a copy of that pamphlet, I remember, and then I had updated it for her, and then she had suggested that I might give a talk at this conference on the very same subject, and so here we are. So I have tried to put together a presentation which combines both the theoretical and the practical, teaching on what is our Catholic theology surrounding death, but also practical experience kind of witnessing, because being a priest, having been a hospital chaplain, I've also seen the nitty-gritty, you might say, of whether it's the dying process or the process of saying goodbye. And so I'm going to share on that as well. This means that we essentially have 3 topics that we will look at. Why we say goodbye, just to sort of set the stage. Understanding death with the eyes of faith. Not everybody who dies has faith, or not all those surrounding a person has faith. And so what does faith change? What difference does it make? And then the subject, how we say goodbye. But obviously the how is informed by the why, and also informed by our faith, which is why that's our final topic. Now, the first interesting thing to note for us as human beings is that we actually do say goodbye. There have been many archaeological studies done of early human beings, and some of the earliest remains that we have that represent religion, in fact, the earliest evidence we have of primitive religion comes from burial rites. In other words, the most ancient religious forms we know of were funerals. The most ancient religious forms we know of surround the question of death. 300,000 years ago. And not even modern humans, more ancient humans, Neanderthals, for example, practiced some kind of burial rituals. The idea of not merely burying someone, but having defined extras that get added on to the fact of burial, we have evidence from 100,000 years ago. Bodies that were stained with pigment. They were decorated, in a sense. The bodies were prepared for burial. Or they were placed in special positions to show a kind of honor and meaning to the body. So this is something that runs extremely deep. The need, the desire to say goodbye in a ritualized way is something that is very, very ancient in human culture. Where does this come from? What is the origin of this? Why do we do this? Well, the Church, in its reflection, particularly at Vatican II in the 1960s, gave a very interesting reflection, a summary, you might say, of the position why we do this, not just as Catholics, but just as human beings. This is a quote from Gaudium et Spes, one of the documents of Vatican II. It is in the face of death that the riddle of human existence grows most acute. Not only is man tormented by pain and by the advancing deterioration of his body, but even more so by a dread of perpetual extinction. He rightly follows the intuition of his heart when he abhors and repudiates the utter ruin and total disappearance of his own person. He rebels against death because he bears in himself an eternal seed which cannot be reduced to sheer matter. In other words, coming from our Catholic tradition is an acknowledgement that the human person, although we are mortal in our bodies, we are immortal in our souls, and we have a kind of primitive instinct about that drives us to reject, in some ways, the mortality of our body, to say to ourselves, that can't be the end. And so, we very naturally want to, first of all, speculate about what comes next, and also to do things that mark the transition from one stage of human existence to another. And that transition, of course, is the transition we call death. But there is, as I say, this indestructible seed that we know we possess in our hearts. There's an instinct about it. And that is why in human cultures, every human culture really, all around the world and all through time, even going back hundreds of thousands of years, there is this drive to mark that passage in a special way. We say goodbye on a subjective level for our own sakes. In a sense, this rebellion that we have against the finitude of life creates a tension in us. If any of us have ever received news that put our own life possibly at risk, we've experienced that tension. It emerges usually most immediately in the form of fear. It can also come out through bargaining, it can come out through denial, but usually it's rooted in that there's this immediate rejection that says, no, 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 this isn't right. So for our own sakes, to be able to deal with that, and to be able to deal with it when it happens to someone close to us, that is when we also give ourselves means to say goodbye. So we say goodbye for the sake of the deceased. We want to honor them. We want to honor their memory. And isn't it appropriate that this talk is being given on November the 11th, Remembrance Day? We want to honor those who have gone on. We also want to do this for the sake of those in a relationship with the deceased. I'm sure many of us have gone to visit a funeral home, for example, where we didn't know the person who had died, but we work with one of their children, or we are friends with one of their family. And so, knowing that they are going through a difficult period, we rally around it. That's another important reason. So there's the sake of the deceased, there's the sake of the family, and then there's for our own sake. We do this because we look to move on. This is a painful time, and we don't want to stay in the pain. There's an important need for closure. And one thing funeral rituals do is precisely because they're rituals, they help us to achieve some measure of closure. The grieving process may take a long time, but at least it helps us get through it in the immediate term. I've heard people say, you know, my family member has died and I don't know what to do. What do I do? Well, by having a sense of a recipe for at least certain things that can be done, it helps us to take the next few steps, to keep the momentum of life going, which is part of the healing process. Very often I've been to funeral home visits. I usually go on the last day and the last period when I go to visit if I can, and I meet the family and I say to them, "You must be tired." And the answer is, "I'm exhausted." And I tell them, that's a good thing. Even the fatigue of the process allows for a kind of de-stressing to occur. It allows you to unwind a little bit and get ready for the next step, which in most cases is the actual funeral itself. So these are important reasons for the sake of the deceased, for the sake of family and friends, for our own sake, to be able to move on. These are good human reasons. You don't have to be Catholic to have these reasons. These are good human reasons. But here's the thing. Are they enough? Are they enough? Someone who works at the Archdiocese recently lost his mom. And I went to go visit with him and offer my condolences, went to his office. And he looked at me at one point and he said, "I don't know how people who don't have faith can get through this." He felt through the process the importance that his faith was, the importance of it to him to be able to go through this very human and universal process. Faith, and this is where we get specifically to our Christian faith, our Catholic faith, does make a big difference. All those people who wonder, does faith make a difference? Just go through this process and we discover what an impact it can have. Death needs to be understood in a faith perspective. Because if it's not, if there is no faith, then death really is the end. That's it. That's all there is. And we are stuck only looking backwards, only looking to the past, what has happened, because there would be no future. But with faith, and with a faith that confirms that instinct that there is an immortal side to us, that transforms our experience. These are a couple of quotes that I pulled from the scriptures, which express, in my opinion, very well the kind of transformation Christian faith, when it's well understood and lived, can bring. From the letter to the Hebrews, Jesus came to deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong bondage. The fear of death, just like the fear of anything else, puts us in bondage. We are not free if we are fearful. We don't have the fullness of interior freedom if we are fearful. So Jesus, who died but also rose and who can share his resurrection with us, that sets us free, or at least helps set us free from the fear of death. It helps us to be a people of courage. Helps us to be a people of courage in the face of the many challenges of life, not just the challenge of death itself. St. Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, says, For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. I remember going to a visit in a funeral parlor, and at the funeral parlor they had a little kiddie section, because it's a long process and the attention span for little children is not always the greatest, and so they would have little table, little chairs, crayons, kids could draw and stuff. And I went over and I saw one kid drawing things, and I sat down. I said, "How are you doing?" "I'm okay." "So what do you think of all this?" And she said to me, "I don't know why everybody's so sad." I mean, none of us in heaven. Why is everybody so sad? Faith of a child, but the faith of St. Paul. It's better to be with Christ. It's better to be in heaven. Nothing wrong with being on earth. You get to color, you get to draw. But what's the big deal? I found that very, very telling. That is the faith of a child. I've also seen what happens when there isn't faith, and how faith, when brought into a situation, can transform it. I would like to tell you the story of my very first funeral. Some of you may know this story. I've told it in the past. I wasn't even a priest. I was a seminarian living at St. Monica's Church, and I was doing my stage, which means it's an experimental time, you know, when you have to learn by doing. And a call came in one night. It was a brother priest who had a call to go to a funeral home and do a service there. But he had found out that his own sister had fallen terribly sick, and so he had to leave town to be with her. And so he was phoning around somewhat desperately to try and find someone to take this service in the funeral home. So I thought to myself, well, it's not a mass. I'm not a priest, but it's not a mass, so I could do it. So I said, okay, I'll do it. Figured, how hard can this be, right? So I got the funeral book off the shelf. I started to flip through it to get familiar with it, picked a couple of readings, put on a tie, got in my car, and zoomed off to the funeral home. When I get there, the funeral director takes me aside and says, "Thank you very much for coming, but there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. The family didn't realize that when they checked the Catholic box off on the form that we would actually be calling for a Catholic priest to come. And they don't really have any faith, and so we were wondering if you could do a service but not mention God too much." No word of a lie, this is what happened. My very first one. So I look at her and I say, "No, I can't do that. But don't worry, it'll work out." Brave words, right? Well, if I was nervous before, now I'm really nervous. So I put on my white robe, and I walk into the room, and I have to say, there was this really oppressive atmosphere. Have you ever noticed that sometimes a room, the air just seems different depending on the mood of the people in the room? There was this oppressive atmosphere in the room. The woman was in her coffin. There were a couple of candles, a number of chairs, people sitting in the chairs facing the coffin, but nobody was saying anything. It was dead silence. So I walk into the room, and people start to glare at me. What is he doing here? What is going on here? So I put on a smile and introduced myself, and I said, we're here in order to say goodbye, and to do so in a way that gives us a chance to look backwards, but also to look forwards. And so, to the extent that you wish, I didn't force anybody, to the extent that you wish, you may join in this time of prayer. And so I had my book, and I have to admit, I kept my eyes in the book a lot during this time. Didn't want to look up too much to see what was going on. So we get to the opening prayer. There's a reading. I explain the reading. What is the meaning of Christian hope? That it's not just about death, it's about life and hope. And that seemed to have some effect. And then we got to the general intercessions. Now we all know what general intercessions are. It's a series of prayers where usually we conclude each prayer with, we pray to the Lord, and the answer is, Lord, hear our prayer. So I told them we'll be doing these intercessions, and you may, if you wish, respond with, Lord, hear our prayer after each one. So I do the first one, and I hear, Lord, hear our prayer. Really, really low. You do the second one, Lord, hear our prayer. Third one, Lord, hear our prayer. The fourth one, Lord, hear our prayer. The volume was going up, the clarity was going up. Unfortunately, in the funeral book, there's a lot of these, so we had time to check it out quite a bit. I had my eyes in that book, and I look up by the end of it, and that atmosphere changed. The look on the faces was different. The glaring of the eyes was no longer there. It was a transformation, really, from the beginning to the end. And so I concluded the prayer. It's not a very long service, you know. I concluded it, and then afterwards, the husband, who I had been told by the funeral director, had made sure to point out that he didn't want a religious thing, came up to me and said, "Will you be able to come back for the burial?" He said, "There's something there." And as I was leaving, a couple of people who were outside smoking said, "What you said about life after death, we believe that." Something about it confirmed something in that. I did not need any further lessons in the seminary about the power of funerals. I can tell you that. I learned it very, very practically. Death in a faith perspective, death in a non-faith perspective, I had the two in one ceremony. We started at one extreme, we ended up in another. And I could see the difference that it made just on people's faces alone. So faith really does make a difference. I'm sure many of you have been to different visits to a funeral home. And one thing I've noticed, and I've confirmed this in talking with brother priests, when the deceased was a person of faith, or the family is a family of faith, the atmosphere in the room is different. This wasn't just my first funeral experience. I have seen it. You walk in and there's a kind of lightness, there's sadness, a sadness of separation, but it's very different. And St. Paul expresses this in his first letter to the Thessalonians. He says, "We would not have you ignorant concerning those who are asleep, brethren," brothers and sisters, "that you may not grieve as others do, who have no hope." He's telling the Thessalonians, it's okay to grieve. There is a pain of separation. There's no question. It's okay to grieve. But there is hope. Hope in a future that really does exist. A future that is grounded in the fact that Jesus, a historical person, rose from the dead, a historical event. It's extremely important as something that is transformative for our human existence. From the Catechism of the Catholic Church, there is also an important mention which helps us to understand that our hope is not a passive hope. It's not as though we're just waiting. There is an active dimension that those of us who are left behind can still be involved in. We can participate actively and contribute to the hope of the deceased. The Catechism says, "All who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation. But after death, they undergo purification, so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven." This is the Church's answer to the classic question, what happens if you die and you weren't a bad person, but you weren't perfect either? What side of the coin do you fall on? And the answer of the Church is heaven. The good news is it's heaven. But since heaven is a place of perfect holiness, there does need to be a time of purification afterwards. It's kind of normal. I remember hearing an analogy of this, that it was a bit like joining a sports team, you know? If you want to play hockey, kid wants to play hockey, and the team is having the tryouts in the fall, well, you may practice before the tryouts in order to have the best possible chance of getting on the team. And so if you've done that, the coach will say, okay, you're on the team. If you've done it, but, you know, sometimes you slacked off, you might not be in the greatest shape, the coach may say, well, you're on the team, but you're going to have to sit on the bench for a bit while we train you up. But you're still on the team. The only people who aren't on the team are those who don't show up for the tryouts. But those who really want that, they have an opportunity. So this reality that's mentioned in the Catechism We give it the title in our Catholic tradition, purgatory, but it's a good thing. It's part of heaven. And what an amazing thing about purgatory is that those who are experiencing it can be assisted by those of us who are still walking around on this earth. We're still in communion with them. That is why I have labeled this slide our active hope, because we can be part of an activity, a process, and contribute to the hope of those who have gone on before. This fact structures our Catholic funeral rites a great deal. Our Catholic funeral rites are not simply about saying goodbye and looking to the past. It's also turning towards the future with hope, and beyond that, they're designed to actively contribute to the full salvation of the deceased. We get the privilege of being a part of that process. Now, as we consider the reality of death, the moment of death, we have to, at some point, consider our own. St. Paul says, oh, you know, it's better to die and be with Christ. And I'm sure we're all thinking the same thing, but just in case we're a little more hesitant than he is, there is a process of learning to address this that is good for us. Ideally, while we're alive, those of us in this room, we should prepare for our own passing, for our own death. This could mean having a will. I know some people who put off having a will because they just don't want to think about it. It's not really healthy. It's not really Christian. The idea is you're preparing for a journey. If you're about to go on a trip, you don't say to yourself, well, I really don't want to think about packing the bags. No, you get ready for every stage of that trip. So that's what preparing a will is. Planning our own funeral, thinking about the arrangements. The lady who wanted 3 copies of that pamphlet, she was already in that mode. In fact, she was getting other people ready for her funeral. I thought that was great. I thought that was actually very healthy. St. Ambrose, the Archbishop of Milan, the bishop at the time who helped convert St. Augustine, he wrote, "The Lord allowed death to enter the world so that sin might come to an end. Death, in this context, is a Passover to be made by all mankind. You must keep facing it with perseverance. The word death must not trouble us. The blessings that come from a safe journey should bring us joy." It's like going on a trip. It's like going on a journey. That's what St. Ambrose is saying. In another passage, which I didn't put up on the screen, I don't have it on the slide, but he mentions that, imagine if there was no death. Imagine if we lived in a world of sin and there was no death. You know, there was no limit to the extent to which suffering could continue. Goodness, that would actually be worse. That would be worse. So this text that he wrote is actually, it's called a treatise on death as a blessing. That's a powerful way of considering the reality of death. Now we need to understand that death is not merely a moment, it is part of a process we call dying. There's a long element of Catholic tradition where we pray for a happy death. Some of you may come across prayers for a happy death in some of the older prayer books and devotional manuals, and it's something that is a reality. And we pray, we ask the Lord so that we may have a happy death and one that is not sudden and unprovided. A lot of people today say, oh, I want to go quickly. I want to go fast. In fact, our tradition is it's okay to want to go without suffering, but it's also important to be able to live it as a journey for our sake and for the sake of all those who love us, who care for us, who will make that journey with us. We start to say goodbye, not just at the funeral home. We start to say goodbye while the person is still alive. It reinforces bonds of unity and even reconciliation. How many times have I heard people say, I wish I could have said this or that thing before the person died, but I didn't get the chance. So the dying process allows those words to be spoken, and it's part of our own journey, those of us who are alive. And it also helps us to grow in compassion, because the dying process is composed of little deaths, small losses along the way, a weakness of body that requires you to have someone else care for you. A loss, people feel a loss of dignity very often. Someone who is in a dying process may get to a point where they cannot feed themselves, or where they have to be changed and wear a diaper. And there's a sense of a loss of dignity that comes with that. We can grow in our attentiveness to people, even if it's as simple as seeing that the glass of water next to their bedside is empty and filling it up without them asking. Those little gestures are responses to the little deaths. And they're a sign of the hope, and it's a message of dignity for the person who's going through the dying process. This is why things like palliative care are so important. It's not about curing a person, but it can be about healing them. A cure is not the same thing as a healing. And I have learned this in my ministry as a priest. You see, I have mentioned here 3 important sacraments. I call them sacraments of healing for eternal life. I'll admit I didn't exactly make that up, but that's part of the theme of what they are. The sacrament of reconciliation is about that process of reconciliation with God. The anointing of the sick, which is so often perceived as the sacrament of the dying, is not in fact the sacrament of the dying. Yes, it is meant to be received if a person is sick and seriously ill to the point where perhaps they start to consider their own mortality. And yet, it's really meant to be a sacrament of healing. I know people who have received the sacrament more than once. Obviously, they didn't die after each time. They received it as a source of strength and as a way of offering to God, as a spiritual sacrifice, the process and the reality of their illness. Sometimes it does bring physical healing. I have seen some amazing things, and honestly, you talk to any priest who's had an active role in the anointing of the sick, and they can share with you at least one story of an amazing thing that happened from that sacrament. But I have also seen healings that weren't cures, but they were definitely healings. One time, as a hospital chaplain, my pager went off, went to the hospital, and there was an elderly lady lying in her bed, asleep but not waking up. She had pneumonia. And at her age, her state of weakness, she couldn't cough hard enough in order to bring up the fluid, so she was going to die. You know, pneumonia at that stage is terminal. There's really no question about it. And the doctors, the nurses, had told her daughter, who was there in the room, that your mom was going to pass. And so she had called for the priest to come and do whatever it is priests do in order to comfort her mom and comfort her. So we prayed together, and I offered the elderly lady the anointing of the sick. And then I turned to the daughter and I said, now you need to understand, this is not really the sacrament of the dying. This is the sacrament of the sick. Your mom is sick, so she qualifies. But it's a sacrament meant for healing. There's no sacrament that can stave off death forever, but that doesn't mean there can't be a genuine healing. So look for the healing. Whether it's a sense of peace, a calm, whatever it might be that she experiences, look for the healing. A couple of days later, I look in the newspaper, the woman had died. And her daughter had been really very distraught. You know, mom was dying, and she was really, really very distraught. And so when I saw when the date and time of the station was going to be at the funeral home, I thought, I'll go. So I went in that evening, and I see the daughter there. She was fairly tall, so it was pretty easy to spot in the room. Her back was to the door, so I walked in, tapped her on the shoulder, and she turns around and she goes, Father Tom, when you said look for the healing, you weren't kidding. Well, what happened? I'm curious to know. Well, I left mom that night. I got in the next day, and she was sitting up in bed. We had a lovely chat. She said to me, "You know, dear, I have pneumonia, and I'm probably not going to survive, but I'm really glad we had this chance to speak and to spend this time together." Mom settled down for a nap in the afternoon, passed away in her sleep. So the lady died, but that doesn't mean she wasn't healed. Doesn't mean she didn't receive a special grace. That proves that the resurrection is real. And the daughter, who was so distraught that evening, had lit up, so much so that her friends didn't quite understand it. It turns out one of her friends was a former co-worker of mine back when I worked at Ericsson. Her name was Sue, and Sue tells me, "Yeah, she's telling this weird story about her mom who was, unconscious but suddenly came back. We don't understand it, and we don't understand how she is so happy, why she's so beaming. Her mom just died." I said, "Well, because these are sacraments of healing, not just for the woman, but for her child as well." The sacrament of communion, the Eucharist, is when given to the dying, is called the viaticum. Via, meaning the way. So it is bread for the way. It is the bread for the journey. That is its purpose. And it is the final sacrament. That's the true sacrament of the dying. However, given that people who are dying very often can't receive it, in reality it's often the anointing of the sick, but the true sacrament is really meant to be communion. Now, once death has come, we have to understand that it is really a privilege to be present. It is a sacred moment. I have been present many times in the room when a person has passed, and there is an awe about it. It is just one of those moments that is irreplaceable. You don't forget where you were when that moment comes. And I'm willing to bet that if I had to sit down and catalog all the times and describe each of them to you, I would be able to do so. Each one is unique and special. And it is important that this be lived well and lived in a way that our faith traditions can help us with. The immediate spiritual action, for example, that we can do if we're in the room when someone passes, is to bless the person's body. Because that body was a temple of their soul, a temple of the Holy Spirit. And so that body is holy. So very often if I'm there, I will invite the family members to just simply trace the sign of the cross on the person's forehead. Much like we did when they were baptized. We do that for little babies when they're baptized. And the funeral rituals we have very often parallel those of baptism, an entry into a new life. We'll often say a common prayer, the Our Father, which concludes with the line, "Deliver us from evil." Or the Hail Mary, "Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." And those prayers come alive in a special way in times like this. And I have seen, again, the power of these small rituals. Again, one time I was paged at the hospital. Pager goes off, I phone in, they say there's a lady here, she's hysterical. And the social worker is with her, but she can't do anything. We don't know what's going on, we need your help. So, okay, what happened? Well, it turns out her husband had been brought to the emergency, and he was in one of the beds in the emergency room, and he died. He died while his wife wasn't there. They had phoned to call her and let her know, but while the nurse was on the phone leaving a message, the wife walked right past the nurse's station to her husband's body, which hadn't yet been moved. And she found him dead with no preparation whatsoever for that encounter. Well, she flipped out. She completely flipped out. And created, apparently, a huge scene. So they wheeled the body into a side room, they put the lady in the side room, and they called the social worker to come in and try and be with her, but nothing was happening. She had been shattered in that experience. So it was the minister of last resort, You call the chaplain, right? So I go in and I say, so what's going on? The doctor practically pushed me into the room and closed the door, you know? And so I saw her there, and I thought, well, okay, she's experiencing something she has no idea how to handle. We're going to take this one step at a time. I asked her for her name, her husband's name. I didn't even know that. And then I got a sense of what her faith is, and we said a prayer. We blessed the body with the sign of the cross. I actually blessed some water and used holy water to bless him as well. We said a number of prayers together, and as we did so, I let her experience her emotions, but tried to help channel them a bit. She began to calm down. Remember how I said at the beginning, something happens, we don't know what to do? She didn't know what to do. She was so caught by surprise. But by having these ritualized moments that tapped into her faith, she was able to help deal with it. So then at a certain point I said, I'm going to step out of the room, and I'm just going to go talk to the doctor. So I step out, there's the doctor and the social worker looking, going, is he going to get out of there alive, you know? And sure enough, I just explained to them what was happening, and is the family coming? Yes, the family's coming, and okay, so we worked it out. And the lady pokes her head out the door and says, can you come back, Father? I'd like to keep praying. So we continued until the family showed up, and they took over from there. So these little gestures, again, they seem so small, and yet they are extremely important. Now, with regards to the funeral process itself, and this is the pamphlet that was prepared that you have, funerals are actually a process. It's not a moment, it's a process. And there are three key elements, phases, or moments in this process: the visitation, the funeral liturgy, and the burial. And so in your pamphlet, these various elements are described. The visitation is really a time for looking back. That is the key period where people get together and they speak about the deceased. And that is where we will usually see lots of photos, little videos, people talking about what a great guy he was or what a wonderful woman she was. It's a time of looking back, of appropriating the past, reappropriating the past, bringing it into the present. That's its key function. Here in Canada, we very often do it at a funeral home. In most cultures of the world, it's been done in actual homes. You would wake the person in the living room. Priests nowadays, we often get waked in church, actually. That's what the custom is around priests, I guess, because that was their home where they worked so much and had so much of their life. But usually it's in the funeral home itself. Then there is the funeral liturgy. This is the key moment. It's the central moment where we are asking God to bring this person into the fullness of the kingdom. So what I usually tell people at a funeral liturgy is I say, we've had a chance to look back. Now it's time to turn around and look forward. It's time. That's what the purpose of the funeral liturgy is, to start to shift our gaze from the past to the future. Customarily, this is done with a Mass. It's important to do it with a Mass because, again, the Mass is a renewal of the death and resurrection of Christ. It's the living Jesus who comes to us in the Mass. And so we are asking the Lord to save the dead person, bring them into his kingdom. It's not just any other kind of prayer service. It's the sacrifice of Christ on the cross being applied, that redemption being applied to that person. Very, very powerful prayer moment within the context of our spirituality. There are a few awkward questions that sometimes arise. If a person wants to have the funeral liturgy for whatever reason in a funeral home, I told you the story of my very first one, and that was in a funeral home. It's possible, but under our norms, we don't do a Mass in a funeral home. And people are sometimes confused because they see it's a chapel. They say, well, it's a chapel, why can't you do Mass in the chapel? And the answer is, it's not really a chapel. What it is a corporation that has built a meeting room that evokes the image of a chapel, but it's not actually a chapel, and we don't want our liturgy to be part of their corporate business plan. You see? So we don't do Mass. We can do prayers anywhere, obviously. We'll pray. But the Mass, the sacrifice of the Mass, that really should be in our churches. That's really where it should be. It's the church, the physical building, is a symbol of heaven. It's a symbol of coming home to God. And so it's most appropriate to have a Mass, and it's most appropriate to have that Mass in a church for those reasons. But again, that doesn't mean that we won't pray in other places. I'm very happy to go and pray, because sometimes I know it might be a family where faith is not strong, but who knows what transformation can come through it. I lived it, my very first one, so I know that it is possible. With regards to the burial, we bury a person in the earth because in the biblical story we were created from the dust of the earth. You are dust, and unto dust you will return. And so we go back to the earth. We can also be buried in a mausoleum. Those of Italian extraction, there are a number of mausoleums, and it's often the tradition to bury a person in a mausoleum. And that's okay too. It's evocative of the passage in the scriptures where Jesus says he has gone on to the Father's house where there are many rooms, and he prepares a place for us. So that mausoleum is in a sense an image of the Father's house, a place being prepared for us. There are other customs as well that exist, being buried at sea, for example, that also exists. We bury the body. Sometimes there is cremation. And in that case, we bury the ashes, or the ashes are placed in the mausoleum. But it's important that we understand it is truly the person in their integrity that is being laid to rest. With cremation especially, we're starting to see some curious customs. This scattering of ashes, okay? Or even creating small souvenir urns. You can buy a big urn with a bunch of small ones so everybody gets a piece of the ashes to bring home. Oh no, this exists. This exists. And with cremation, we're finding that when people do that, the closure doesn't happen. If you've still got mom or dad with you, sometimes even just a piece, you don't have that closure. And if the ashes are scattered, let's say on the river, you have no place to go for a subsequent visit. Closure becomes the same thing as forgetting about it, which is not closure. And so we're finding that people are experiencing this in unhealthy ways. Even cremation, one thing that happens sometimes, and this is going to sound odd, but it's true, people don't always come to pick up the ashes. If you've got a body, it's got to be buried. If you've got ashes, you can wait, and wait, and wait. I was in a parish once where a funeral home called and said, the funeral director was a man of faith, and he said, I have a problem. I have all these ashes that nobody's come to pick up, and my bosses at the funeral home told me to get rid of them because they were taking up space. So I brought them all home and they're in my garage. What do I do with them? We laugh, but it's tragic. You know, the idea is the person died, we had the body incinerated, so the ashes cremated, the ashes are there, and we're not even going to go to the next step. That's not really saying goodbye at all. That's saying good riddance. That's not the same thing. Our funeral traditions require us to have a place and have a mechanism to truly say goodbye all the way. Which is why cremation is permitted, but you have to bury everything. And it has to get buried. That is part of our tradition. There's no question about it. I actually was chatting with a Muslim individual at one point, and he said to me, and this shows the gravity of the question. He said to me, you Catholics, I don't see why you don't believe in the resurrection anymore. You used to. I said to him, well, I can assure you that we still do. Of course, Muslims believe in the resurrection too. I said, I can assure you we still do. And he said, well then, how come you're all cremating people now? You know, if you really believe in the resurrection of the body, you should honor the body more. That was his instinct. Now, again, we do allow cremation, and honestly, you know, cremation in our history has always been allowed on a limited scale, particularly if the person who died had a disease, communicable disease. You had to cremate, there was no question. But there is something there. We want to make sure that our traditions honor the body and don't take away our faith in the resurrection. Remembering the deceased is important. Oh, actually, I'm just going to go back and finish those points there. The common questions. Non-Catholics having a Catholic funeral? Yes, it is possible. We will do a funeral for a non-Catholic Christian, particularly. We'll pray for anybody. But if for funerals themselves, we'll do them for non-Catholic Christians who share the faith of the resurrection, as long as it's understood it wouldn't be something contrary to their own beliefs. That would be disrespectful to them, obviously. We don't want to ever go contrary to that. And the question of cremation I have already addressed. So remembering the deceased, again, it is goodbye, not good riddance. So what can we do? A common tradition is to have a mass said for the deceased. You know, to make an offering in order to have that person's name remembered in a special way at Mass. I have found this to be very powerful. When I started working at the diocese, I wasn't in a parish during the week, and so I didn't usually have Mass to say for community. So what I did is I put up a form on my website, and I said, if you would like to have a Mass said for an intention, just fill in the details and I'll remember it at Mass. There's no money involved, it was just looking for intentions. And I got Mass intentions from all over the world. Not all for the deceased, some for the living, because you can pray for the living too at Mass, but quite a number. So I have prayed for the deceased from, in Brazil, in India, all over the place, thanks to the power of the internet. It's a nice tradition, it's an important tradition. It leverages, you might say, the power of the Eucharist. The Feast of All Souls, November 2nd, is another important part of our tradition, and usually the first 10 days of November, November 1st to 10th, is a time to visit cemeteries. It's classically a time to visit cemeteries. Visits to the cemetery outside of that time as well are important. Not because there's some morbid sense, but because we want to be able to occasionally be present where our loved one is. We know that they're sort of everywhere in God's mind and in God's Spirit, but that concrete location is important. Finally, there is a tradition in the Catholic faith called indulgences. There are two kinds, partial and plenary. I won't get into the details, but what it means is these are spiritual sacrifices that we can make which contribute to that purification process of the person who has passed. We unite ourselves to them in that way, and it helps them to move through that process even more efficiently, more effectively, you might say. And so this is an important part of our spiritual tradition. Little story, I'm an auxiliary bishop, which means that I have a diocese, but it's a diocese that doesn't really exist anymore. Some auxiliary bishops have dioceses that literally are underwater now. Mine isn't. Mine is in Italy, believe it or not. It's an ancient diocese that was in the mountains, and because transportation was so difficult, they created a local diocese so that there would be a bishop close to the people. But as roads eventually came in and what have you, that diocese, it didn't make sense to have all of the administration and everything else. So it got absorbed into a larger neighboring diocese. And so my diocese, the Diocese of Treba, which is actually outside of Rome, it's a place of water sources that flows into Rome, the aquifers of Rome. So it doesn't exist really anymore. The place still exists. There's about 1,500 people that live there apparently. I've seen it on Google Earth. I know where it is. but it doesn't exist as such anymore. But it once did. So I decided, on the Feast of All Souls, I'm going to say a Mass for the deceased of my diocese. I don't have any living members anymore, but surely there are some who've gone on who could probably use the help. Besides, if there aren't, I'm sure the Lord can, work it out with somebody else. But the point is, it became really the only way I have left as bishop of that diocese to contribute to the salvation of the people there. It would make no sense outside of the context of faith. But in the context of our Catholic faith, it makes perfect sense. As a final point, it's not just about how we say goodbye. The spirituality of hope is also, how will we say hello? We need to remember that every goodbye through death will one day be followed by a hello. The spirituality of hello. Consider these passages. Paul's letter to the Romans. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed in us. Speaking of the resurrection and the transformation of the universe. Or this passage from the book of Revelation. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no man could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes. We say goodbye. We do so not saying goodbye forever. We do it in our Catholic faith, saying, until we meet again. That is the meaning of the Catholic goodbye. That is the meaning of our Catholic funeral traditions. Thank you very much.